This video is brought to you by True Tales of Buried Treasure, the largest collection of old treasure magazines in the West. On our website, you can search for individual treasure stories by region, or buy our original magazines themselves. To pay us a visit, please click on the link in the description. Enjoy. Two rugged Alaskan sourdoughs, Antonio Tony Panza and Olaf Svensson, leaned in close, their eyes gleaming as they shared a tale that seemed almost too wild to believe. They weren't speaking of an ordinary mine, they assured me. This was something far grander, a vast mountainous deposit of gold, silver, and copper buried high in the Talkeetna Mountains. No place richer, Panza declared with unwavering conviction. Not in the north, maybe not in the whole world. But the trick is, Svensson added, his voice tinged with a trace of regret. Someone's got to find those lodes again. They've been lost for years. The pair made an intriguing contrast. Panza, with his dark eyes and fiery Italian demeanor, was a perfect foil to Svensson's quiet, pale-eyed resolve, emblematic of his Swedish roots. Both men, though well into their 70s, moved and spoke with a vitality forged by over 50 years of surviving Alaska's harsh wilderness. They had seen it all: prospecting, trapping, logging, and trading with indigenous tribes. Together, they were as tough as the landscape they called home. I had met them by chance in Anchorage, where a delay in my westbound flight left me idling in a town known as the air crossroads of the world. The delay came from a tragic crash in the mountains, and so I found myself frequenting a small bar with an unassuming diner tucked behind the counter. The food was simple: eggs, bacon, and potatoes. But it was the kind of place where you could strike up a conversation with anyone. Panza and Svensson were regulars, early risers like me. At first, they kept to themselves, but after a few mornings of shared coffee and eggs, they began to open up. When they finally shared their story, I could see why they had hesitated. It wasn't just any tale, it was the stuff of legends. Rumors swirled at the time about a grand expedition being organized in Seattle to search for a lost gold placer near the upper Yukon. But Svensson waved it off. That one in the Talkeetnas, he said, would be 10 times richer. And so began their account of the lost mine. In the early 1900s, near the head of Cook Inlet, several tribes lived in what was then called the Nyakotana settlement. Among them, in the village of Knik, a fur trader had married into the community. One spring in 1903, 5 indigenous men ventured deep into the Talkeetna Mountains. Only one returned, barely alive, his body ravaged by the ordeal. In his possession were several pounds of ore, half of it gold. The fur trader, seeing the potential, became obsessed. Despite the survivor's harrowing story and the loss of his companions, he convinced the man to lead him back to the site. The journey was brutal. They packed out 20 pounds of gold, but the trader's health was wrecked by the ordeal. He staggered back to Nick, a shadow of his former self, his body skeletal and frail. The story hung in the air between Panza and Svensson, its weight unmistakable. They spoke of the lodes with a mixture of awe and melancholy, knowing full well that their discovery could reshape fortunes, and yet they remained tantalizingly out of reach. The gold of the Talkeetnas was still out there, waiting to be found. Mining the gold in the Talkeetna Mountains, it was said, was like signing your own death warrant. The challenges were insurmountable, and even the silver and copper ore samples brought out of the area were of low value. Yet the allure of the gold haunted the fur trader, who spoke of it often, fueling dreams of untold riches. His tales inspired 4 brave prospectors to form a company, hiring local Nyakotana guides to lead them into the mountains. These tribespeople, it seemed, had known about the region's precious metals for centuries. The expedition was grueling. Mosquitoes, glaciers, and treacherous moraines pushed the men to their limits. Without the guides, they likely would not have survived. When they returned, they brought with them ore so rich in gold, it was almost beyond belief. Yet even they concluded that no fortune was worth the deadly risks. It was around this time that Antonio Tony Panza and Olaf Svensson arrived in Knik after descending from the Alaskan range. They spent the winter listening to the fur trader's stories. When spring arrived, The pair decided to risk it all for a chance at the legendary gold. They bought a pack horse, loaded up supplies, and headed north into the wilderness, knowing full well they faced an 80-mile journey fraught with hazards. From the very start, the marshlands between mountain ranges proved nightmarish. Swarms of mosquitoes and biting flies attacked relentlessly, leaving the horse bleeding constantly from their bites. To shield it, they draped leafy brush over its body, especially its head, but the insects still managed to draw blood. Climbing the mountainsides to avoid the boggy terrain, they encountered glaciers and unstable moraines, equally dangerous and unforgiving. With no reprieve, they were forced to return to the marshes, where the insects eagerly awaited their return. Prodding for firm ground with a long pole, Panza suddenly plunged into a hidden hole, sinking up to his neck. Desperately thrashing to free himself, he was rescued by Svensson, who used the pole to anchor him and drag him back to safety. Exhausted, they retreated to solid ground and built a large, smoking fire. Panza stripped off his mud-caked clothes to wash them, but the insects swarmed him even as he stood close to the fire. In the end, he was forced to put on his still wet clothes to protect himself from their relentless bites. The next day, they detoured nearly 10 miles before finding a spot to cross. The terrain offered no mercy. Mud and water reached their knees, and hidden holes often dropped them to their waists. Their horse, weakened and struggling, frequently bogged down or lost its footing, sometimes rolling onto its side and dampening their supplies. On one occasion, the animal sank so deeply that Svensson had to wade in to rescue it, only to nearly disappear below the surface himself. With Panza's frantic encouragement and the aid of deadwood poles, they managed to pull both Svensson and the horse to safety. That night, camped on solid ground, they debated whether to press on or turn back. All three, men and horse alike, were visibly emaciated, and the journey seemed increasingly impossible. Yet, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were close. Deciding to push forward for just one more day, they set out at dawn. Their route led them through a wide belt of timber before bringing them to yet another moraine. Panza climbed a tall tree to scout the terrain ahead. From his vantage point, he saw the snow-covered peaks of the Talkeetnas dominating the horizon. To his relief, only one more swampy area lay in their path, and it didn't appear to be as dangerous as what they had already endured. Elated by this glimpse of hope, they pressed on, their dream of reaching the fabled gold still alive. The pair pushed onward, finally reaching the edge of the marshy terrain. Stopping to assess the ground critically, they probed the surface with their poles. Svensson shook his head in dismay. "I don't think we, or the horse, have enough strength left to cross even this small moraine," he muttered. "If we'd been half smart, we'd have gone up the Susitna Valley," Svensson added regretfully. "But the Susitna route would have more than doubled their journey." Determined to press forward, they moved inland toward a small glacier that fed the marshland. After scouting, they found a narrow stretch where the bogs were less than half a mile wide. Carefully, they navigated their way across, avoiding serious mishaps, until they reached firm ground. Grass sprouted green from the earth, offering a hopeful reprieve. Exhausted, they camped there for 5 days to recuperate. The horse grazed heartily, regained some weight, and seemed visibly stronger. Meanwhile, the clear air provided breathtaking views of the Talkeetnas, now so close it seemed one could reach out and touch them. Panza and Svensson studied the peaks daily, carefully planning their ascent. Eventually, they identified the jagged, sawtooth-like peaks to the east, where the gold-laden ledge was said to lie, high above the timberline. At the base of the rugged mountains, their camp was suddenly invaded by brown bears. 2 had to be shot to protect their supplies and the horse. Although they successfully fended off the attack, the bears' wild and frenzied charges destroyed some of their precious food stores. Determined to continue, they aimed for the second highest peak before them, beginning their climb. For 3 arduous days, they made their way upward, detouring frequently around cliffs and obstacles. Finally, they emerged onto a gently sloping bench that led into a wind-sheltered cove. They set up camp there just before sundown, grateful for the protection. The next morning, they set out again, scaling the peak's side. To their amazement, they soon located the legendary Golden Ledge. It bore clear evidence of past activity. Gold-bearing quartz had been pried loose and hammered out. The markings suggested that indigenous peoples had worked the site long ago, and perhaps a few early prospectors had also taken their share. Eager to confirm the richness of the find, they gathered samples and tested them. To their astonishment, the yellow metal proved to be genuine gold. The amount recovered from just a single clay retort was staggering. For the rest of the day, they explored higher along the mountainside, marveling at their discovery. Over the following days, they surveyed the surrounding peaks and slopes, brimming with the excitement of having found what so many had only dreamed of. 9 mineral-bearing lodes were discovered in the Talkeetna Mountains, but the richest gold ore came from a vein that had clearly been mined before. Panza and Svensson wasted no time, extracting quartz that contained an astonishing 40% gold. They carefully selected a few high-grade pieces from every 100 pounds they removed. The ore was packed below and crushed with hammers on curved surface stones, and with the abundance of water streaming down from the melting ice and snow, panning for gold was relatively straightforward. It was grueling work, made only slightly easier by the long Arctic days, but their labor paid off. By the time the first storm of the approaching winter struck, forcing them to halt for 3 days, they had already recovered more gold than their packhorse could carry. The richness of the nearly 3-foot-wide vein astounded them, and the thought of their newfound fortune kept their spirits high despite the harsh conditions. One night as the storm raged, a curious horizontal lightning phenomenon lit up their camp with a bluish-white bar that streaked through the sky before disappearing to the east. Neither of them was frightened. They had seen such things before in the Alaskan wilderness. With the storm gone, they made plans. They decided to load the packhorse with as much gold as it could carry, while they would shoulder the rest, leaving room for only 3 days' worth of food. It was risky, but they hoped to hunt wild game along the way. Their escape route would take them west across the Susitna Valley, with the mighty Met McKinley, Denali, standing in majestic relief against the horizon. The valley, they reasoned, would be frozen solid, allowing faster travel to their base at Nick. Setting off in high spirits, they scanned constantly for game, but found none. Their food ran out, and after 2 grueling, foodless days, they finally managed to kill a bull moose. They camped immediately, roasting meat over the fire and eating extra portions to soothe their aching, empty stomachs. They prepared additional meat for the journey ahead, but a sudden blizzard trapped them in their camp for 3 days, delaying them even further. When the storm finally lifted, they resumed their trek. The Arctic days turned sunny, and despite the 2 feet of snow, they pressed onward, following frozen creeks that fed into the Susitna River. Nights, however, brought bitter, below-zero cold. Once again, they ran out of food. Snowfall resumed, and they struggled through the growing drifts, using the river as a guide to avoid getting lost. Starvation loomed, and the poor horse was reduced to eating tree limbs and twigs to survive. Then, miraculously, they stumbled upon an Indian village just as their strength was failing. Snow-blind and nearly frozen, they were taken in by the villagers, who fed and sheltered them. A howling blizzard followed, raging for 2 weeks, but they were kept safe and warm in a small hut, while the horse was housed in a log and brush shelter. When the storm finally passed, the men tried to continue their journey, but the snow had grown so deep that they managed only 2 miles in 6 hours. Realizing the futility of their efforts, they turned back to the village. The Indians warned them that it would be impossible to travel until late spring, and so Panza and Svensson resigned themselves to waiting out the winter. Each day, they waded through waist-deep snow to gather tender branches to keep their horse alive. As spring approached, the horse began to fare better, and the men supplemented their monotonous diet of dried fish with wild game that began to reappear in the warming weather. The villagers, restless as the season changed, began preparing to leave their winter quarters for their traditional hunting and fishing grounds. Panza and Svensson decided to alter their plans. Originally intending to follow the little Susitna River south to Cook Inlet, they now sought to take a more direct route. With the help of 6 Indians, they set out southeast toward the Matanuska Valley, hoping it would be a quicker path back to civilization and to safety. The journey to the Talkeetna gold was fraught with challenges, and even success came at a great cost. As Panza, Svensson, and their Indian guides pushed through melting ice and softening moraines, their packhorse burdened with gold and supplies, eventually gave out and died. The remaining gold was redistributed among the group, including 2 squaws, who bore the load through treacherous terrain. Despite relentless hardships, they finally reached Kivett. Upon arrival, the pair sold some of their gold to the local trader to buy goods for the Indians who had helped them survive the ordeal. As a gesture of gratitude, they prepared supply packs for the guides to take back to their village. However, when questioned about the source of their newfound wealth, Panza and Svensson offered only vague explanations, revealing that the gold came from the Talkeetnas, but omitting crucial details about the exact location. After a brief rest, the 2 men packed up and headed for Cook Inlet, stopping at Anchor Point where whalers and trading schooners docked. They secured passage to Juneau and eventually Seattle, bringing the remainder of their gold with them. They used the money wisely, ensuring they always had funds for future endeavors. Despite their fortune, they never returned to the Talkeetnas. The ordeal had taken its toll, and they were content to prospect elsewhere. Over time, the Talkeetnas continued to lure adventurers, but their stories often ended in tragedy. In the year following Panza and Svensson's departure, a group of 4 prospectors with 6-pack animals set out for the mountains. Only 1 man returned, having lost everything. Another group, led by Indians, vanished entirely. In 1907, a third party of 5 prospectors reached the gold, silver, and copper lodes and brought back some gold. Despite their glowing accounts, none of them ever attempted the journey again. Between 1908 and 1915, several expeditions departed for the Talkeetnas. Supplies were hauled by pack animals or carried by hired guides, but none of these groups managed to relocate the mineral-rich ledges. The region fell silent, though occasional quiet searches were rumored, until 1919, when the lodes were rediscovered. This sparked the formation of the Alaska Three Metals Mining Company, headquartered in Anchorage, with additional offices in Chicago and Cleveland. Stocks were sold widely in the eastern United States, generating a surge of interest. Among those drawn to the venture was Harold McCracken, an Alaskan explorer and wildlife collector. Invited to join the company, McCracken accompanied a group of officials north to lay the groundwork for mining operations. They traveled by railroad and then packed their equipment 40 miles into the Talkeetnas, where they pitched camp in a basin-like area. Remarkably, the group located the lost lodes without difficulty, despite none of them having been there before. Samples were collected, and numerous claims were staked for the company. Tests confirmed the exceptional richness of the gold, silver, and copper ores. Yet the company's plans took an unexpected turn. A mining engineer joined the group briefly, but left without making his report public. Soon after, the mining promoters disappeared and the investors were left with nothing. The failed venture attracted significant publicity, both in Alaska and the lower United States. Prospectors flocked to Anchorage and used the railroad to reach the Talkeetnas, hoping to find the elusive riches. However, the company's filed claims were vague, and the regions remained unsurveyed, leaving the exact locations of the lodes uncertain. Despite their efforts, all returned empty-handed. As tales of the Talkeetna's mineral wealth spread, more expeditions were mounted. Experienced miners and greenhorns alike attempted to locate the lost mine, but none succeeded. The repeated failures perplexed Panza and Svensson, who kept a close eye on reports published in Alaskan newspapers. The allure of the Talkeetna gold persisted, drawing treasure seekers year after year, yet the fabled lodes remained hidden, their secrets buried deep within the unforgiving wilderness. "Not long ago, we took a drive up that new highway," Svensson told me. "We just wanted to see the country again, the place where we nearly lost our lives. From one particular high point on the road, you can get a clear view of those saw-toothed peaks. The rich ledges lie right under them." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "You can almost see them if you know where to look." The grueling hardships Panza and Svensson endured more than 50 years ago are now a thing of the past. The journey to the Talkeetna Mountains is much easier these days, thanks to modern highways and railroads that bypass the insect-infested lowlands, bogs, and treacherous moraines they once had to navigate. Since Anchorage became a hub, the trek hardly qualifies as dangerous anymore. Instead, It's a scenic adventure with breathtaking views and abundant wildlife. For today's travelers, the Talkeetnas present an opportunity for exploration without the life-threatening perils of the past. The indigenous peoples who once knew of the gold were reluctant to speak about it, and their descendants now know little to nothing about the legendary Lodes. When asked if they had ever considered returning to stake new claims, Panza and Svensson laughed at the idea. "We've got no family to leave it to," Panza explained. "We don't need to hustle for $1 anymore. There's enough money in the bank for us to live comfortably for the rest of our lives, so why take the risk?" Svensson agreed, though he admitted they might not even be able to find the Lodes again. "It's been over half a century," he said. "Frost in the ground and erosion work fast. The veins of gold, silver, and copper could be buried by now. Ice packs tear down mountains in ways you wouldn't believe. That might be why no one's found the Lodes. They could be hidden under landslides from above." Panza smirked. "Greenhorns have it too easy these days. Imagine trying to find a gold mine in an airplane or with one of those fancy four-wheel drive buggies." Modern technology has changed the way people explore the Talkeetnas. Powerful motor vehicles and snowmobiles make it possible to travel during the frozen months, and airplanes offer a bird's-eye view of the rugged terrain. Each year, groups of adventurous prospectors, some seasoned, others hopelessly inexperienced, gear up in places like Juneau and Nome to try their luck. The area is more accessible than ever, with highways and railroads linking Anchorage to Fairbanks. While the region is far from overpopulated, it is home to hundreds of trappers and prospectors who spend their days exploring Alaska's vast wilderness. Even though there have been no recent reports of successful expeditions to the Talkeetnas, it's likely that hopeful treasure seekers still attempt the journey each year. Panza and Svensson, however, were dismissive of modern-day prospectors. "They couldn't find a hatchet if it was tied to them," Svensson scoffed. "And if one of those greenhorns found a chunk of gold, he probably wouldn't even know what it was." When asked why they didn't consider spending their twilight years in California, the two men were visibly appalled. "This is God's country," Svensson declared. "There ain't no better place to live than right here in Alaska." The reasons why the lost lodes of gold, silver, and copper have remained undiscovered for so long are still unclear. Perhaps they are buried under landslides or hidden in some uncharted crevice of the Talkeetnas, but the minerals are there, and one day a lucky prospector will stumble upon them. Even if the main veins are buried, smaller deposits could have surfaced over time, offering clues to the treasure's location. Harold McCracken, the explorer who had camped near the Lodes with the ill-fated Three Metals Mining Company survey party in 1921, reflected on the mystery years later. Flying from Fairbanks to Anchorage in 1967, he gazed down from the plane and spotted the basin and bench where they had once camped. In his 1968 book, Roughnecks and Gentlemen, he mused over why the mine hadn't been rediscovered and reclaimed long ago. The Talkeetnas remain as enigmatic as ever, their riches hidden, waiting for a new generation of adventurers willing to take on the challenge of uncovering their secrets. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to read the original article or purchase the magazine from which it was taken, please check out our website, truetalesofburiedtreasure.com.